Hello, welcome to Tripping on Legends. I am your host, Christopher Balzano, and I am back from last week's insane journey into the Ocala National Forest. And it was quite a crazy trip. It was an eventful trip. And I'm going to talk about tonight two of the legends that I encountered and looked into. Although I'm going to say that based on what I have to say at the beginning of the show tonight, as well as what I'm going to be talking about in the beginning part, we might not get to the second one, which is perfectly fine because I'm trying to go back to doing these on a weekly basis. So there might be I might be a little bit long-winded on this first one that I'm going to talk about tonight. Not only because there's a lot to talk about, but also because I want to give you guys an opportunity to share, especially given the two things that I'm going to be introducing tonight. The number to call, and it's in the comments if you are watching live. If you are watching live, congratulations. You are getting this. You are getting the opportunity to participate. I always go live. I'm on IGTV right now. My Instagram account is Spooky Tripping. And on on Facebook Live as well, Facebook /Tripping on Legends, which is really kind of the one-stop shop for everything. It was funny, I was on Jeff Belanger's show last night, and he was giving my website address, and I'm like, no, tell him to go to the Facebook. Tell him to go to Facebook. There's a lot more going on there. Those are the two platforms that I'm on right now, and if you are watching live, then you can feel free to call at 813-418-6822, and those that is in the comments. You guys can just get it there if you need. And of course, you can call that number anytime if you want to share a legend that you have, if you want to talk about a question you might have that we bring up or anything like that. If you want to call me an idiot, this show is called Tripping on Legends because I am constantly revising what I'm discovering out there. And tonight, both of the things tonight are examples of stories that I started following and they went one way and then all of a sudden they swooshed and went another way. So I'm excited about that, but I want to start with a kind of an announcement. Once again, if you're following the social media, then you know that I am very close, very, very close to being signed to my next History Press Arcadia book. I gave them several different suggestions just based on stuff that I already had and stuff that I knew that I could get. One was Curses, and the other was the Ocala National Forest. They seem to like the Ocala National Forest idea better, so it's in the process right now. I should know by the end of the week whether they're officially going to go with it. So I'm really excited, and I'll push that over to the side for a little bit because that's what the majority of tonight's episode is going to be about. The second announcement, it's kind of a dual announcement, is that right now, Tim Weisberg and I have decided to go forth with Haunted Objects 2. So if you know the history of Haunted Objects, essentially it was a book that was kind of like 2 years in the making because the publisher wanted it, they didn't want it, they wanted it, they didn't want it. They said, bring on a co-author. I brought on Tim. And it ended up that the publisher themselves completely failed to market it the right way. If you have read Haunted Objects, it's a really good book. And I'm not just saying that because I wrote, half of it. I'm saying it because it's this really excellent mixture of folklore having to do with haunted objects and then real cases, real people we were able to talk to, real experiences. And it goes the entire spectrum of uplifting ghost stories to spooky ghost and frightening ghost stories. So it's really a good read. The publisher not only didn't know how to market it the right way, and Tim and I obviously know how to market. We were, enthralled in para-relations at the time. We went forward. We were on every radio show with it. But the publisher from their end didn't quite get it. And the publisher went under. And their assets were sold off. Their stock was sold off. Last year around this time, I tried to get copies of Haunted Objects because I was doing my crazy road tour of events, and I wanted them to sell, and I could not find them anywhere. Somewhere in a warehouse, there's like 1,000 copies of Haunted Objects, and Tim and I wanted to sell them, and they're nowhere to be found. Well, the good news is that Tim and I have decided, because the rights have reverted back to us, to go forward and republish Haunted Objects. So we're going to independently publish, which means it's going to be a lot less money for you, the reader, independently publish, reissue Haunted Objects. And as we were talking about that, we started to realize that pretty much we had an entire book of other stories that we could share, right? So we're working on Haunted Objects 2. So if you have, and that's the worst name of all time, right? I mean, that's like Haunted Objects. It reminds me of, what do you call it? True Romance, when he's like, coming home in a body bag 2. It's going to have a much better name. But if you've got a story of a haunted object that you want to share with me, please call me, email me at spookytripping@gmail.com. Contact me on any of these platforms, and I want your story. I've already gotten some people who have contributed some really amazing stories, and so it's interesting because I'm writing Haunted Objects 2 with this hand and editing Haunted Objects with this hand to get that out so we can release that, and it's really long. Haunted Objects is like twice as long as any other book I've written, which is good because I had a co-author. So, but the other part of this is that I'm hoping to be able to announce officially that I'm going forward with Haunted Ocala National Forest. Tonight, if you've got a story or a legend that comes out of either the forest or the surrounding communities, please feel free to call in. If you don't want to call in, please feel free to contact me about it. But I'm going to go a little bit into the history of my relationship with the forest. Before I get going, I want you guys to see the amazing pictures that I have. These were sent to me by the amazing artist, Della Daughtry, who's become my partner in This Town is Myth, which is so in line with what we're going to talk about. I'm trying to like even myself up so I'm right under the picture. She's made the 4 pictures that are around. If you've got other artwork that you want to contribute, feel free to get in contact with me, and I'll give you my address, because not only am I in need of artwork, but I'm lonely. You can come over and visit. It would be amazing. So years ago, and if you know me, this part of the story is kind of old. Years ago, I was asked to look into the Freetown State Forest. And I didn't know what to expect. I was starting to already do research into the Bridgewater Triangle, so I knew that, it had this bigger context to it. And I was told to get in touch with Owl and Owls, which I did, before I ever stepped foot in the forest. And I knew that something was weird, something was off. Almost immediately before I ever went to the woods. It was incredible to me that there was so much there that was confusing, was weird, was unexplained, which was and in a place like the Bridgewater Triangle, it was it was unusual in a place of unusualness, right? Like it already was this crazy place, but now this was like an apex, which seemed to be the heart of it. And everything seemed to be connected. And that's kind of what was the weird part of it. And I went forward with the idea that there was something dark or tainted in the woods. Like I got like double Robert going on. That for some reason there was a darkness there that was drawing weird things in. And not only weird things, but you could even say evil things. It was a magnet for the darker side of the human personality, in terms of the serial killers, in terms of the cults that were making it there. It was drawing in all kinds of powerful people, but it seemed to emanate and radiate this offness that was being used, I felt, used by a lot of negative people, and they were sensing it. And they were doing bad things there, which was kind of then creating these other waves that were drawing people in. And I thought that if I could answer that question, can the same thing that's causing these zombies, same thing that's causing these ghosts, same thing that's causing these negative paranormal experiences people were having, if I could somehow connect that with the crime that was going on and the vandalism that seemed to be going on, that I could answer something. And it really became, in the years since then, almost 15 years now since then, it's become the question of why, right? Why is this place like that? And that's a question that can't be answered. I mean, I've now been on, dozens and dozens of radio shows and TV shows talking about the Bridgewater Triangle, and I have no answer for you. I have no reason for why it is. It just is, right? And every time you think you know it, you peel back a layer of the triangle, and you're left with more stuff. You're left with what seemed to be a cause now is just seems to be an effect. I got a very similar feeling the first time I went into the shadow of the Ocala National Forest. This is a story that I definitely know I've told before, but for the sake of those people who are new to the audience, years ago, I was asked to speak in Astor, Florida. I'm going to Astor this weekend with my kids. We're going to actually investigate the library there, which is kind of the heart of this all, the center of this all. So Natalie and I got there, and almost immediately we both noticed that our voices echoed. So we were standing right next to each other. We were outside unpacking the car, and our voices seemed to echo just from getting the 2 feet away we were from each other, right? There was a weird thing going on with waves, with sound waves. The next thing that happened was that we were taking pictures, right? Kind of promotional pictures. And even though it was 11 o'clock in the morning, no matter what pictures we took there, except for of the sign, everything was dark, right? So it seemed as if, once again, the waves were being messed up somehow. We went in and we spoke, and everybody had a story to tell. We ended up spending the entire day. We were going to do something else. We ended up spending the entire day in Astor just looking into some of the legends that we got during the library presentation, and everyone had a story to tell. And all the stories kind of had like a weird slant to them. And I thought, this feels to me a lot like Freetown. It feels to me a lot like a Bridgewater Triangle thing going on here. That kind of, as I started to do more research into the forest itself, that kind of played itself out, right? Because now I was looking at these things, and once again, we had a lot of unsolved crime. We had a lot of UFO reports in addition to paranormal activity. We had a lot of unexplained things happening. People who lived on the fringes of the forest would talk about seeing things all the time. Ghostly people who would just come up into their driveway. Then I started to do a little research into the rainbow cult, the rainbow people, rainbow children, which I don't want to get into yet until I feel like I can legitimately talk about who they are and what they believe and things like that, but they're there. And people always say if you go shopping around the forest, make sure that you check everything to make sure that, one of the rainbow people hasn't tried your deodorant before or taken a bite out of something. So there was a lot of similarity to it. Then I started tracking legends. So this is like 3 years ago. Now I'm tracking legends, right? And now I'm seeing that there is a very similar sense as there was in the triangle of ghost stories outside of the triangle seem to take on a certain theme and a certain tone and a certain narrative. Ones that are inside kind of are a little bit different. And so I started to get this idea to write this book. Fast forward a little bit, and we go to Hog Island. In addition to getting a lot of ticks, which, once again, one of my 4 fears, ticks, we discover a noose that we believe was where either the African American who we found the article on, or I found the article on, was hung, or the swamp witch, which is what the story says, was hung. Mark Muncy goes there a week later, and the noose isn't there, right? And this noose looked as if it had been there for years. Then introduce, this is all kind of building up to what we're talking about tonight. Now introduce Della Daughtry into the equation, and her trying to save Wild Cow Prairie Cemetery. And basically, essentially telling me that I've gotten everything wrong, which is good, right? Tripping on legends. And in talking to her and her husband, I get this notion, this idea that things in the forest and in the towns that are surrounding it, and I'm saying that loosely, 45 minutes out of the way, which in Florida, 45 minutes, it was what it takes for you to go from one end of Cape Coral to the other. It's not like it is up north. Things shift, right? They're there at one point, and then they're not there. You go someplace and there's a rock, and then you go there the next week and the rock isn't there anymore, and you go 3 days later and the rock's there again. There's a weird shift that happens, which I believe is something attuned to, or something like related to, or a vortex. So that word's been thrown around a lot in the last couple of years, but I honestly feel that there's some kind of dimensional shift thing going on there. And I think it gives rise to a lot of unexplained activity. And now we're getting into my realm, right? Because when people can't explain, especially in a situation like that where it's part of your lifestyle, when you can't understand what's going on, you make up a story about it. And so there are a lot of unusual things that are happening. And so to make that abnormal, how you doing, Haunted Nation? To make that abnormal as normal as possible, you fall back on a story that is familiar. And tonight's a really good example of unexplained activity that has the most mundane backstory or the most mundane legend attached to it, but it's something that's really going on. So if you've been following me, you know that last week I went I was going into the forest, and I ended up hitting 5 or 6 different places, depending on how you look at it. And I was driving up, so it's about a 3-hour drive. The way that I was going to do it, I was going to hit, because I woke up late, to be honest with you, and got a late start. Rather than going on the east side, which is quicker, I decided to go on the west side. And I ran into, well, if you've seen the picture, you know what I'm talking about. As soon as I crossed into the town of Ocala, my tire was completely shredded, and I ended up skidding out on the highway while going 85 miles an hour. My front tire was completely shredded, and by completely shredded, I mean I cut my hand getting it off because the wires were sticking out. That's how bad. And so I was stuck there on the highway. And I was like, this is great. This is like hashtag follow the sign. The signs are telling me, do not continue this book. Do not continue this research. Walk away. But of course, me being stupid me, I decided to continue anyway. So that was my welcome to Ocala. And we had kind of been there before. Last summer around this time, I think it was like this week, 2 years ago, we went to the Silver Springs. And what I'm going to talk about right now is one of the places two of the places, hopefully, that are in Ocala. Maybe one, depending on the time. Thank you very much. I am okay. And actually, I wrote a review for Tires Plus because they were amazing. I was in and out of there, and it was crowded. I had to practice all of my social distancing. It was crowded in that Tire Plus, and they had me in and out with 2 new tires and aligned in like an hour and a half. When I was a few years ago, 2 years ago, I spoke at, or I was at a vending booth, if you will, vending table at the Astor Geek Festival. Great event. I'm sad that they're not going to have it this year. I'm pretty sure they're not going to have it this year. And I drove all the way out to Astor to sell books and to meet people. And I ended up interviewing this guy who told me a legend, and it was a pretty straightforward legend at the time. And I was like, wow, that's something really interesting that I'd love to follow up on. Thank you very much. And I remembered that it was in the forest, or he said it was in the forest. And I remember he was totally convinced this was a true story. Both the activity and the legend that he was talking about. So I pulled out that old interview because I was like, oh, I think I've got a forest one that I got from the the Astor Geek Festival, and it ended up being about a place called Fort King. And my world for the past 6 months has been floating around Fort King. What I'm going to talk about tonight has been, it's really essentially, it falls not only under Tripping on Legends, but also This Town is Myth. Because it's directly connected to the Dane Massacre. It's directly connected to the Ocala forest, as I talked about, but also a lot of these ideas that I've been exploring when it comes to This Town is Myth, which is why I think I can't just pass it off as half an episode. I think it's gonna be the whole one. So Fort King, and I was able to go there. Fort King is in the town of Ocala. A lot of the information I'm going to tell you tonight comes from legendsofamerica.com. I always like to give my sources, and I was able to speak to Kathy Weiser Alexander, who gave me kind of some follow-up on this information and led me some other different paths. So the fort was established in 1827. So when this is at the height of the United States wanting to move all of the Native Americans west, right? To get them off the East Coast, off these places which were considered so much more civilized, and push them off into those places which we had yet to fully develop. And they ended up, I'm trying to get the exact, okay. So they ended up creating this thing in Ocala, which was meant to deal with the Seminoles. So if you know Florida history, the Seminoles are really the remnants of mainly the Creek, a few other tribes, and as well as African Americans and who formed the Seminole Nation. And everything around here is very based in Seminole, Florida State Seminoles. And there was a lot of fear for them because unlike other Native Americans, they had already been pushed, right? They had been pushed into Florida. This was not where they lived. They were forced to mix with other tribes here that they didn't necessarily get along with, and so they were less likely to go peacefully. So in Ocala, which was not Ocala yet, I don't believe, they formed something called the Seminole Indian Agency, right? And this Seminole Indian Agency was designed to negotiate. It was designed to create pacts. It was designed to offer assistance, food, all with the intent of now go to Oklahoma, right? Get out of here. And of course, the United States being the United States, we decided to make sure that that olive branch was backed up with some very big guns. And so Fort King was established as this kind of gentle buffer with ammunition to deal with Native American issues and Seminole issues in that area. And we're talking Central Florida, so we're really kind of talking where the rest of the country kind of dumps into Florida. So they established this base, this fort, and things start to change. And it's really kind of just like, there's no skirmishes, there's no fighting, anything like that. It's really kind of creates this balance, although it's obvious where the power is supposed to lie, until 1929, in which time the forces leave, right? And when the forces leave, there's kind of nothing to stop the tiny skirmishes between the settlers in Florida and the Native Americans. And so there start to be these little battles and these little skirmishes and things like that. And then finally in 1830, President Andrew Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act. And so now it's become official. Now it is law. You will get out of here. I love this line right here. Well, that comes a little bit later, but it's still a great line. You would think Andrew Jackson said it. So Fort Brooks now becomes much more of a fort, right? To reinforce. Now we're talking First Seminole War, leading into the Second Seminole War. Then in 1835, we have the real turning point of things here. So I want you to imagine, and I know you guys really can't, but imagine if you're looking at Florida, Disney World, and go a little bit, to the west, and then Tampa, right? So I've driven that stretch, that's pretty much go and then I-4. But there's this road which is called first it's a Native American road between it, and then it becomes what they call King's Road, and King's Road connects Fort King and Fort Brooke. Right? So some nasty things start to happen in Fort Brooke, and there's kind of all these skirmishes, and there's all of these treaties that are being signed that are being denied, and so it's one of those situations where there's this thing called the Treaty of Payne's Landing, where some Native Americans say, some Seminoles say, yes, we agreed to go out and we're going to do it in 3 years, but the problem is that the people don't stand for the whole Seminole Nation, right? It's way too large, it's way too complex, and so a lot of the Seminole chiefs disagree with it, and there's all this bad stuff that's happening out of Fort Brooks. People are sailing. This is kind of horrible. People are sailing out of Fort Brooks, and then they Seminoles sink the actual ships. Right, they sink their own people's ships because they consider them traitors. I'm going to read this here for you. So in August 1835, so this is leading into the late summer, Private Kinsley Dalton, who was carrying the mail from Fort Brooks to Fort King, was killed by the Indians, by the Seminoles. In November, Chief Charlie Empthla, wanting no part of the war, led his people towards Fort Brooks, where they were going to get on ships to go west. So it's Fort Brooks is in Tampa. That's in the Panhandle. So you can just take the water of the Panhandle and go to Oklahoma. This was considered betrayal by other Seminoles, and he was killed by someone who's going to become important in what we're talking about, and that's Osceola, right? So Osceola essentially kills other Seminoles because he considers them traitors. And they were threatened, right? So this gentleman, Wiley Thompson, who is now kind of in control of Fort Brooks, Fort King says, should you refuse to move, I have then directed the commanding officer to remove you by force. So shit's coming up. The way that I heard it in the reenactment was that Osceola was meeting with these other people to decide what to do, and people were waiting for the word from Osceola to attack. On December 28th, 1835, we have what's known as the Dane Massacre. And I've talked about this. You can read my work on this. This is a huge event in Florida history, maybe the biggest event in Florida history, in that 108, because 2 survived, 108 people who were on the road from Fort King to Fort Brooks on this thing known as the King's Highway were ambushed by Misanthrope. I know I'm totally getting that wrong. Jumper, and some other people, some Seminoles, who essentially wiped them out. Right? The Americans were outmaneuvered. They were outthunk. One of my favorite elements of it, not that 108 people dying is should have a favorite, but is the fact that they wore such big coats the Americans, that they couldn't get to their guns. The Americans, the troops are wiped out. They're annihilated. There are very few casualties on the Seminole side, and the Seminoles essentially then leave them. They just leave them there. Depending on lore, there's lore that other people then came in and finished off the knife work, if you will. But those people, because this becomes really important, those people had decided to build kind of a little bit of a shelter as they were fighting. It's this little triangle. And if you go into Bushnell, you'll see the little triangle. And that's where the majority of the people who died there were buried, I should say. There are tributes to the officers who died all down the path, but they were essentially buried in this triangle. Then they were interred, and they were shipped off to the pyramid a place on the pyramid. I need to do research on what this pyramid is, in St. Augustine, which is considered like the most haunted town in Florida. And that's pretty famous, right? There are only two people of that march who survived. One is John Sprague, who we talked about, or James Sprague, who I talked about in terms of the Stikini and all of that. So that kind of plays into this whole story. Later that day, in Fort King, Osceola, who was originally was in this meeting and was, they were waiting for his word to do the Dane Massacre, but they decided to do it without his word. He attacks Fort King. And in doing so, he kills several soldiers who are stationed there, but he gets General Wiley Thompson. So General Wiley Thompson is the one who said, "I'll remove you by force," right? Dude shot 14 times outside of the base, like on the gates of the base. He's shot 14 times. He's scalped, and parts of the scalp are given to everyone who is involved in the raid, right? So all of these people who are involved with it all get this little keepsake, and that's kind of the history. Now, here's what happens. In that, other soldiers died. In the time that it's a base, other soldiers die, right? I mean, it's a base, it's a fort. They are buried right outside of the base, like a little bit away, but outside, on the premises of the fort. Their bodies are eventually dug up and also sent to St. Augustine to be laid to rest in the National Cemetery at the pyramid. So we have, same day, this is important, same day, we have these two different attacks. The places where the attacks happen have a very similar history, as in one gets shipped off and then the other one gets shipped off a little bit later. So very similar histories. The fort is kind of abandoned as the Seminole War kind of goes on. It's abandoned temporarily in 1836 and then is burned down by the Seminoles. The Americans come back, the U.S. military comes back, and they rebuild it in 1837. But then in 1843, the Seminole Wars are over, and they just decide to leave, right? Everything is well as good. They don't need this kind of command post for the Seminoles anymore, and this buffer and this war station. And so they just kind of leave it. It eventually becomes the first Ocala courthouse. Then that's torn down. And it's kind of the different parts are sold off to all these other different businesses in the area that need materials and all that stuff like that. But it's a really important symbol of this conflict between the Native Americans and the American troops, right? In this whole kind of Indian removal movement. And the fort itself, like I said, I went there. The fort itself doesn't shy away from that, right? So it doesn't try to whitewash history, doesn't try to give you an inaccurate picture of what happened. Like it celebrates both of the people on both kinds of people on both sides of this, and just gives you a realistic picture of what happened there. The fort has been rebuilt, right? So the fort that's there right now was built in 2007. 2004, the area itself was kind of designated a national monument, national historical landmark, and then in 2007, they rebuilt the fort to the specifications. So if you go there, it's not impressive. I've shared some of the pictures, and I'll post some of the pictures that go along with this, but it's not overly impressive. And if you go there, it's just a wood structure, right? It's just fence, really. Then you have the two main buildings, and so the first story I was told goes or takes place outside of the fort, so on the land of the fort, but not in it. And the story that this man told me was after the killing of Wiley, so after Osceola comes in and kills some of the troops and the war is on, there is a soldier who's stationed there who decides to, at nighttime, go to the spring to relax. There's a spring right there. And he meets a beautiful Seminole woman. So hashtag haunted love. They fall in love almost immediately. And he slips out every night. He tries to get out of guard duty, all that kind of good stuff, so that he can meet this beautiful woman who he's now said, you know, when this war is over, we're going to get married, all that kind of stuff. And they meet by the moonlight and the stars and all that beautiful love crap. His group, or he's part of a group that is sent off to go on a raiding party. They're sent off to reinforce this place and attack anyone that they see along the way. They're ambushed, and the entire troop, which was only like 6 or 7 people, gets wiped out. I think you guys probably know where this is going. The Seminole woman hears about this. She goes down to the spring and she kills herself. Good news is the man makes it back. The man was not killed. He's the only one of this little group who makes it alive. And he goes back to the fort, and he goes to the spring. And he sees that his beautiful bride-to-be has taken her life. And he takes out his gun and he kills himself as well. And 2 things come from this. One, their ghosts are trapped at this spring. And at nighttime, especially in December, when this supposedly happened, there's an unnatural mist that covers all of Fort King. This mist gets thicker when you make your way to the spring, and people have seen their ghostly figures walking across the water towards each other. The sad thing is that they both dissolve before they get to the middle. So they're on separate ends of the spring. They start walking towards each other, and they dissolve. The second part of it, and people since then have been reporting all kinds of weird lights there. They report this weird fog. Some people have said they've seen these ghostly figures. The second part of it is that the spring itself has become tainted. And so no longer does it give fresh water, and no longer is it this beautiful spot, but it's kind of overgrown and murky, and the water itself, much like Tomoki, the water itself has become tainted and shall never be pure again until these two spirits are actually able to find each other once again. And I would agree. Like, if you're talking orbs, Margie, I'm talking to you. If you're talking people seeing orbs, if you're talking people seeing even the fog, and I'll talk about the fog in a moment. I'm not quite sure swamp gas and the ignition of that can be confused for people actually seeing figures and seeing people walking across the water. So that's why I would disagree with an easy explanation for that part of the legend. I was there. It's pretty dirty. As a matter of fact, the guy said, the ranger I was talking to, as I was tromping through the woods, he said, it's not going to look like a spring like you think it looks like. It's not going to look like Silver Springs. It's pretty much just like a hole in the wall, a hole in the ground filled with a whole bunch of like disgusting water, which it is. The water itself reminded me, especially because it is in a circle, it reminded me a lot of Hog Island. It reminded me of that swamp circle that we found there, and that greenness that was kind of coming from the algae and stuff. So this is a true legend, right? This is something that when I went and I was able to speak with the rangers who were there, they said this is what people say. They both have said they've never seen it, but that other people have told them of the story, that the story is a well-known story in the town on Fort King. It's interesting, Fort King, when I went there, was hosting a summer camp, right? So there were a whole bunch of little kids running around with no air conditioning. And those two rangers, Omar and Candace, which one of those names is not real, but I'm not going to tell you which one, they were very vocal about it. They were like, yeah, weird stuff happens here. And I asked them about the swamp, and they immediately said, yeah, people have said, as long as they've both worked there, they've said it. Now, I was talking to Omar more, and I was asking him, because he's actually in charge of closing things up at night. So he does several different sites, and his night ends with going to Fort King and closing everything up and making sure everything's locked up. And I asked him about this fog, and he said in the time that he's worked as a ranger there, he's never seen fog roll in to Fort King. He said that there's condensation, like this thick condensation, and this kind of like total humidity, like a blanket. But he's never actually seen fog. Although it would make sense, because if you've been in Florida in December, they do have those crazy hot days and then the cool nights, and it gets hot in the morning. And so it would make sense, but he said he's never experienced it, and he's been there for over a year. So he's had an opportunity to be there through December. But this is something that people really, honestly, legitimately believe in and have witnessed. So I went there, and I'm going to hold off on my story at the spring for a moment. I went to the fort, and I talked to these two rangers, and their immediate response to me was, oh, you're talking about the cemetery. It's like, well, what are you talking about? I didn't even know there was a cemetery at the time. Tripping on legends, make mistakes. And they said, oh, well, in the front, there's a cemetery, and the people who were buried there were removed and taken to St. Augustine. I'm like, oh, you mean like, isn't that the Dane Massacre? Like, no, the same exact thing happened here. And so they pointed me out to the trail where that cemetery is. So the story goes that it originally was burial mounds. Now, I'm having a little bit of trouble, only because I'm in the opening stages of this, finding out which tribe predates in that area predates the Seminoles, right? So based on the geography, its proximity to Tampa tells me maybe Tocobogan. I know I'm pronouncing that wrong. maybe Timucua, because we got the Timucua that are in, on the other side of the forest. They buried their dead, or at least had mounds where Fort King now is. So even though it's totally a cliche, here in Florida, this disruption of burial mounds is something very real, and mounds in general is very real. So in these places where others had been buried, now the soldiers were buried. And the soldiers were then dug up and brought someplace else. So we have violence, we have water, we have disruption of 2 generations of graves. And they said that there is a lot more ghostly activity in the cemetery than there is in the spring. Spring is in the physical spring, not like spring month of the year. So they talked about people seeing figures walking along the path. A lot of ghost lights. Now this is, I went there once again. There are no headstones. It's not a cemetery anymore. It's just, here's where the people were buried. There's a plaque and everything like that. The focus of the activity seems to be the inside of the fort, right? And people walking from the cemetery to the fort. People on the road have seen, because it's right on the road, right on the main road. I think it's Silver Springs Boulevard or Silver Springs Road. Have seen people who disappear. Once again, that's from the road, people driving by. But people who have to take care of it are like, those people should be on the property, and they pull in and they can't find anybody. But the most interesting part takes place in the Visitors Center, which was closed because of Corona or COVID. But it was pretty much everyone who works in the Visitors Center has said they hear knocking on the windows and look up and no one's there. Or they hear knocking on the doors, what's going on, Lord? They hear knocking on the door and they go out and there's no one there. Or lights turn on and off. Or they get these sudden bursts of chills. They see shadows in the Visitors Center or walking right outside in the windows. One of the people who I spoke to said she heard what sounded like a tree falling and crashing and actually shaking the Visitors Center. And then she went out and there was nothing there whatsoever. And this kind of thing has been happening not only for years, but multiple people are interested in talking about it. Nancy, if you've got some good Sarasota stories, I would love to hear them. You've got to email me sometime about them. So obviously that was totally of interest to me. So I went and I was kind of exploring around this former cemetery, now just a ground and a memorial. I've got my tape player going. Spoilers. Nothing. I didn't hear anything. Oh, forgot to say, there were 2 interesting things that happened while I was talking to the ranger. So I first went in there, and on the Facebook Live that I did, you can see that there's a ball, and then the ball's in a completely different place. And I was totally weirded out. I was totally freaked out by this, and thought that oh my God, something weird's going on. Da, da, da. And I ended up looking at the video, and some kid comes and moves it. You see it. So, but while I was interviewing the ranger, and I haven't gotten to this part yet, while I was interviewing the ranger, the tape recorder jumped off the banister that we were talking about. I haven't heard any EVPs because I was listening to it just for what they were doing. I've got to go back and listen to it. So I decided to go out there. It's really hot, by the way. And I'm asking, is there anyone here who'd like to speak to me? I'm trying to, be in the moment, have an experience, but also just document the physicality of the environment, see what's going on. And I decide to leave. The moment I decide to leave, and I'm walking backwards out of it, a cardinal comes. If you know anything about folklore and birds, you know that the cardinal is often mentioned as a messenger or a carrier between the worlds of the living and the dead. That cardinals are often thought of. There are a lot of reports of seeing a cardinal after someone you love has died, and it's their message that they're okay, or that they're safely being ushered into the afterlife. But cardinals also have a lot to do with tripping on legends. If you go all the way back to like episode 3 and the Singing River, this connection to tripping on legends and birds is very strong. But here's the other thing. The cardinal lands probably about 15 feet away from me, and it's staring at me. It's staring at me. If you see the pictures, the bird's head is right there, and if you listen to the audio, all you can hear is the bird. Like everything else goes away, and you just hear the bird, like almost like the bird screaming at me. But I don't speak bird, so I don't know what it's saying. The Native American bodies are still there, they believe. I start walking towards the bird, and it just stares at me. I am not kidding you, I get within 2 feet of the bird. And it's not moving, and I'm just kind of there with my mouth open because, I mean, it's not as if like it's landed 2 feet away from me. I crossed the distance of like at least 10 feet, and this bird didn't move. It just kept staring at me, like talking to me. The bird then kind of looks, flies off. Crazy. So I then begin like the hour trek around, maybe 45 minutes, to get to definitely got my steps in that day, to get to the spring. I get to the spring, and the cardinal is there waiting for me. Now, here's what I'm going to say. Obviously, if you're in an area, this is the essence of tripping on legends, because everyone in the world can say, you saw 2 freaking cardinals, or you saw a cardinal in 2 places. There's no connection to these things whatsoever. Here's the deal. I rarely see cardinals. But I see them whenever I'm kind of deep into a case. But here's the other part of it. The spring is not crazy deep in the woods, but it's not out in the open. Every time I've ever seen a cardinal, they seem to be perimeter birds. They don't seem to be like deep in the woods kind of birds. I could be wrong about that. I'm not an expert on birds or an expert on the cardinal. But this was not in, and there were no other birds around whatsoever, but this cardinal was in a place that was somewhat remote. Coincidence? Maybe it was, but it wasn't for me because I totally felt connected. I tried to snap a picture, but it flew off. So the picture you see is actually of it flying away. But it was pretty profound because birds have had this really strong connection to the stuff that we've done here at Tripping on Legends. We're about to lose the IG feed, so before I lose them, I'm going to just briefly say I felt I had a guide. I felt that somehow those 2 places were connected. If you want to follow Tripping on Legends, we're on Facebook at Tripping on Legends. Tripping on Legends, Facebook.com, Tripping on Legends. Our Instagram is Spooky Tripping. SpookyTripping@gmail.com is also the email, and our Twitter is Spooky Balzano. So when I lose my IG feed, you guys have all the information. Feel free to call me anytime. Call me. Give me a call. 813-418-6822. But I want to finish the Ocala story. One of the things that I've been working on with This Town is Myth is the fact that no one talks about the ghost stories that are coming out of Sumter County. And no one talks about the ghost stories that are coming out of Bushnell or what used to be Pemberton Ferry, that you can go to Brooksville, which is right across the lake from it, right across the river, and they love their ghost stories, and they're telling them, and there's ghost tours, and there's people who specialize it, and the May Stringer House is like going online every single day, and yet right over the water, nothing, no ghost stories, right? So I went to the Dade Battlefield reenactment back in February, and it was the second time I had been there. And I tried to get EVPs. I tried to talk to people about ghostly activity. Nancy, thank you very much for stopping by. Tell Tim I said hi. Um, no one talks about there being ghosts at the Dade battlefield. No one talks about those 108 soldiers who died on that property, who were buried in this one little area, whose graves were then dug up and shipped off someplace else. No ghost stories whatsoever. However, Fort King, the exact same situation, right? In terms of people buried, and everybody talks about it, right? And the girl I talked to, the woman I talked to, actually even said there were houses built here before they moved those graves. So the houses that are all around the fort before it was marked as a national monument, all report that there is ghostly activity in their houses. And then she threw out this one line, which is really what connects this with Dark Woods. She said that in the neighborhood surrounding Fort King, there's an unusually high incident rate of suicide. So the suicide rate in Ocala is higher, and then in this little neighborhood all around Fort King, it's even higher than that. So there are definitely weird things that are going on in this area. And it's really one of those things that's like, wow, that's the same thing that's going on in the Bridgewater Triangle. It's the same thing that goes on in smaller towns. The Swamp Witch will be talked about in the book, but not on tonight's show. Although it's connected to it, right? Because that is the area of the spring and the area of where the Swamp Witch was physically looked very much alike. So this is definitely some place that is haunted. It's ridiculously haunted. And I also feel, yes, Native American graves were desecrated on this property. Not only were Native Americans killed, but it is believed that they were there before it was Fort King. And that some of those mounds... Now, here's the interesting thing, and I'm responding to a direct question from Margie. Not all mounds in Florida Native American tribes are burial mounds. So it's one of those situations where if you say you disrupted a mound, you didn't necessarily disrupt the burial mound, but it still would have been something that was considered sacred. So it might have been graves, it might not have been graves, but either way, it was something that was considered important and historical that was destroyed. But of course, graves upon graves would explain a lot of what's going on there. That's only one story, right? So excellent, because now I'm gonna have to totally tune in next week to get my second Ocala story. I'm going to be looking into Fort King a lot more. I'm hoping that this is one of those situations where as soon as you put it out there, a whole bunch of people respond with their own stories. Not that I need it, right? Because the book is basically about legends, and these are two kind of different legends or rumors that people are saying about haunted places. It's always good to have a story and a personal experience. But you just go there. I was not anywhere near as weirded out, or it didn't seem as if weird things like the waves that I was talking about, the sound waves and the light waves, were impacted in the same way as they were in other places. But there definitely was a weirdness. Walking the woods, being on the lookout for ticks, I was acutely aware that there was something with me. And it wasn't just the cardinal, although I like to think the cardinal was protecting me as I was going through these woods. So you're going to have to keep in contact on all the social media platforms with the hashtag Haunted Ocala is what I'm going to be going with for all the information that's about this. So follow hashtag Ocala on all of the social media platforms. Instagram, we're talking spooky tripping at gmail.com. Facebook, it is next, just sharing this. It is facebook.com/trippingonlegends. Twitter is Spooky Balzano. And of course, everything can be reached on trippingonlegends.com. If you have a story about the Ocala Forest, if you have something that you want to share about that, if you have something that is relevant to this, or if you have a story about a haunted object, please get in contact with me. But you can also follow the progress as I start to write these stories and kind of pull out this research. I will be tagging everything with hashtag Haunted Ocala. So make sure that you're following that. Make sure that you're getting involved in what's going on. Make sure you're pre-ordering Haunted Love, which is now officially at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all those great places. I am Christopher Balzano. Thank you for tuning in this week. And here's hoping that all your trips are legend.